There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. So all they were telling them was old news. They're not going to say a word about Jericho or Ai because that's too new, because those had just happened in the last couple of weeks. And that would undo their deception, because if they had come away from a faraway land, they couldn't have heard of those battles yet. And so they keep talking about how great their God is and how their people had sent them away to become their servants because of the fame of their God. And then the Gibeonites, they just bring them back to look at their stuff. We're from so far away that all this stuff was new when we left. And now all our water bottles leak and our clothes are worn and torn and our bread is garbage. And it was hot when we left. But they just left yesterday. But your God was so important to us that we had to come make peace with you. So they were so humble and so kind. And they called themselves our servants. So what's not to like about these people? These people think we're great. Finally, somebody got it right. And so all the leaders, they went back and they looked at their stuff, and seeing all the evidence, it supported everything that they said. And then Israel leaders, they wanted to believe this, because if they were their servants and they were a foreign people from far away, they would be paying them tribute, which is money. In Israel here, they're only looking at the evidence, and they didn't seek God in any way. And they gave no time to ask God about what He thought. So they're all walking by sight. They're not walking by faith. And this is the second time since they crossed the Jordan that they made this same exact mistake. They do things and they're doing them without praying, because this is the same mistake Joshua made about not seeking God, like the first time when Israel went up against Ai. And so this prayerless life is starting to become a problem for Israel, not seeking God's will about anything. And so what they do is they actually violate God's law, and they make a covenant. And all of these leaders, they swore to the Gibeonites in the name of Yahweh. And then it was only 3 days later that they find out, because it's almost like Israel, they just start walking through their neighborhoods because it's only 25 miles away. And it's kind of like, hey, what are you doing here, Joe? We thought you lived far away. Yeah. We live here. And even though Israel was deceived, they knew that they couldn't get out of their covenant. And it's because they swore by the name of Yahweh, or else they would have taken God's holy name in vain. And that would have brought about God's judgment on Israel. And we'll see this later, that God did require Israel to keep this covenant that they made with the Gibeonites. Because even after 400 years, King Saul, he will go kill some of the Gibeonites because of his zeal for Israel. And a famine arose during the reign of King David because of what Saul had done to the Gibeonites. And he was told why they were having this famine by the prophets. So this covenant was valid, and God honored this covenant, and He expected Israel to keep their bad covenant. And so now the whole congregation of Israel, they're all mad at their leaders for making this covenant. And that's primarily because they won't be able to plunder the Gibeonites and to keep all their stuff when they destroyed their cities. And so the leaders, they tell them, well, we can't go back on our word, but we'll make them our slaves. They'll cut all your wood and they'll haul all your water. So we're going to try to make the best out of a bad situation. And then Joshua, he goes and he confronts the Gibeonites, but it's too late. And the Gibeonites now, they don't even try to hide the fact that they lied. They make absolutely no excuses at all. They all just admit it. And Joshua, he asks them, why? Don't you know you're cursed now? You're going to be slaves. And the Gibeonites were very honest with Joshua. And they're telling him that they were clearly told that God had commanded Moses to kill all the inhabitants of the land. And they were deathly afraid. They all knew that they were dead men. And even though they don't know this God, they believe him. They believe what he says will come to pass. And they say, you can do whatever you want with us. We're in your hands. And it doesn't say it anywhere, and I didn't read it anywhere, but I think that God was very aware of these people. And I think it's a lot like the way that God was very aware of Rahab the harlot, that there was a people there who wanted to be saved and that they were willing to give up everything they had to be God's people. And you'll see that there's nobody else in the whole land of Canaan through the rest of the book of Joshua who ever tried to seek any peace with Israel except for these Gibeonites. And so God, I believe that he allowed Israel, who wouldn't have had any reason or any right to make any type of peace with these Gibeonites, that he allowed them to be deceived so that the Gibeonites could have peace with God. Because God, he could have always revealed to Joshua who these people were and where they lived. But God didn't choose to do that. God kept silent. And even though the leaders were going to make them their woodcutters and their water boys for the people, Joshua, he had enough sense to make them servants of God. That they would be cutting the wood and carrying the water for the tabernacle, that he's going to keep them very close to the things of God. So he gives them no place to spread their idolatry in Israel. And so I see these people a lot like Rahab, willing to give up all their former associations of their past lives, with all the relationships with all the other peoples and all their other gods to be saved. They were willing to give that all up for this one God, and that they're always knowing that they're not worthy, that they have no right to this relationship, that it's only out of God's mercy and their faith in him that they even had a chance, because they knew before that they were doomed to destruction. They were doomed to death. But God was willing to make a covenant with them to be saved. And you might think that, well, maybe these Gibeonites are a bunch of peace seekers, like maybe they were like some kind of hippies, and maybe it was because they were a weak people and they couldn't fight. But that's not true, because you'll read in chapter 10, verse 2, it says that all of their men were mighty. And I don't get the impression that they ever served God grudgingly, that they only did it because they had to, just because they were being forced. I believed they loved serving their new God, and they served him out of love for him. And that's because he saved them and he gave them life. So I believe there is no place that they would rather be. And if you really look at it, they're not much different here than the Levites, because the Levites, they're the ones who are assigned to do manual labor for the tabernacle. And later on, the Gibeonites will be called the Nephilim, which means the given ones, because they were given to the priests to assist the priests. And their city, of the city of Gibeon, it became one of the Levitical cities. So this became a city of refuge where any person who was being pursued to death, they could flee to. And you'll never read in the scriptures that any of the Gibeonites ever caused any trouble in Israel at any time. And you'll even find that some of these Gibeonite men, that they became some of David's mighty men. And during those reigns of King David and King Solomon, the Ark of the Covenant, it stayed for periods of time in Gibeon. So you can see that God's presence was comfortable to stay with them. And then even after this, after 500 years, and after the reigns of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, and the remainder of Israel were all exiled to Babylon because of their sin of idolatry, the Gibeonites were also exiled with them. But when Israel was allowed to return, you'll see that most of Israel, they didn't return. And that was because they became too prosperous in Babylon. And so they didn't want to come back to this broken city where life would be too hard. But the record shows that 500 men of Gibeon, they returned, and that they came and they helped to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And there's a part of me that thinks that if any of the other inhabitants of Canaan, if they would have turned from their gods, and if they would have sought peace with God, and if they were willing to serve him, I believe God would have found a way to save them too. And you might think, well, this is a pretty good story. But how does this apply to us today as believers? And I would say there's a couple ways that this applies to us. We see these types of situations in our Christian lives when we see like a believer and they knowingly make a covenant with a non-believer, like a marriage. And we can see it when a non-believer will give a little God talk, and they'll pretend allegiance to the believer's God to be able to deceive them because they want to get married, and they want to have a husband, or they want to have a wife. And our God is very clear here that we're not to be married like that. We're not to be unequally yoked. And you'll often see the believers to try to justify this relationship with the non-believer, saying, oh, they believe something. They're just not a mature Christian, but they're growing. But there's no real fruit. And then they might go point to their good works as evidence to prove that they have some kind of belief, to prove that they are who they say they are. But it's all manufactured to get a covenant. And then we see these marriages, when you'll see some of these take place, and you'll see that nobody before getting married, they ever really sought God to try to find out what God thought, because they don't want to know what God thinks. They want to get married. But then after the marriage happens, and then there's problems, and the marriage doesn't work out because they don't have the same beliefs. And now they're admitting that they're not a believer, or one of them's not a believer. The other part of this that takes place is that as a believer, you need to keep your vow. You're not allowed to desert the marriage. And what you'll see that oftentimes, and not every time, but often, if they will stick through it, you'll often see, like with the Gibeonites, that God will redeem that marriage. And sometimes they'll become believers. And now we're going to kind of shift over to communion, and we're going to think about our covenant, because God, he made a covenant with us. And this covenant and this story, it should give us hope, because we don't deserve this covenant. We were bound for death. You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.